Hi friends, today we see about friction. When even a very smooth surface is viewed under a microscope, it is found to have roughness and irregularities which may not to be detected by an ordinary touch. If a block of one substance is placed over the level surface of same or of different material, a certain degree of interlocking of the minutely projecting particles takes place. This does not involve any force so long as பா வச்சுட்டு படுப்போ அது எதுக்கு எடுத்துட்டு போகிற வை எதோ படிப்போம் எதுவும் அதெல்லாம் கிடையாது. If a block of one substance is placed over level surface of the same or of different material, a certain degree of interlocking of the minutely projecting particles takes place. This does not involve any force so long as block does not move or tends to move. But whenever one block moves or tends to move tangentially with respect to the surface on which it rests, the interlocking property of the projecting particles oppose the motion. This opposing force which acts in the opposite direction of the movement the upper block is called force of friction or simply friction. It thus follows that at every joint in a machine, force of friction arises due to the relative motion between the two parts and hence some energy is wasted in overcoming the friction. Though the friction is considered undesirable, it plays an important role both in nature and in engineering. Example, walking on the road, motion of locomotive on rails, transmission of power by belts, gears. The friction between the wheels and the road is essential for the car to move forward. Types of friction. Static friction. It is the friction experienced by body when at rest. Then dynamic friction. It is the friction experienced by a body when in motion. The dynamic friction is also called kinetic friction and is less than the static friction. It is of the following three types. Sliding friction. It is the friction experienced by a body when it slides over another body. Then rolling friction. It is the friction experienced between the surface which has balls or rollers interposed between them. Pivot friction. It is the friction experienced by a body due to the motion of the rotation, as in case of footstep bearing. The friction may further classified as friction between unlubricated surface and friction between lubricated surface. Friction between unlubricated surfaces. The friction experienced between two dry and unlubricated surface in contact is known as dry or solid friction. It is due to the surface roughness. The dry or solid friction is induced sliding friction and rolling friction. Friction between lubricated surfaces. The boundary friction or greasy friction or non-viscous friction. It is the friction experienced between the rubbing surfaces. When the surfaces have a very thin layer of lubricant, the thickness of this very thin layer of the molecular dimension. In this type of friction, a thin layer of lubricant forms a bond between two rubbing surfaces. The lubricant is absorbed and surfaces and forms a thin film. This thin film of the lubricant surface is less than friction between them. The boundary friction follows the law of solid friction. Fluid friction or film friction or viscous friction. It is the friction experienced between The rubbing surfaces, when the surfaces have a thick layer of lubricant, in this case the actual and surface does not come in contact and thus does not rub against each other. It is thus obvious that fluid friction is not due to the surface in contact, but is due to the viscosity and the oiliness of the lubricant. Limiting friction. The maximum value of friction force which comes into play when a body just begin to slide over the surface of the other body. It is known as limiting force of friction or simply limiting friction. Laws of static friction. The force of friction always acts in opposite direction to which body tends to move. The magnitude of the force of friction is exactly equal to the force which tends to the body to move. The magnitude of the limiting friction F bears a constant ratio to the normal reaction between the two surfaces. So we can write mathematically F by Rn is equal to constant. The force of friction is independent of the area of the contact between the two surfaces. The force of friction depends upon the roughness of the surface. Law of kinetic or dynamic friction. The force of friction always acts in the direction opposite to the which body is moving. The magnitude of the kinetic friction bears a constant ratio to the normal reaction between the two surfaces. But this ratio is slightly less than that in case of limiting friction. For moderate speeds, the force of friction remains constant but it decreases slightly with the increase of speed. Laws of solid friction. The force of friction displays directly proportional to the normal load between the surfaces. The force of friction is independent of this area of the contact surface for a given normal load. The force of friction depends on the material of which contact surfaces are made. The force of friction is independent of the velocity of sliding of one body related to the another body. Laws of fluid friction. The force of friction is almost independent of the load. The force of friction reduces with increase of the temperature of the lubricant. The force of friction is independent of the substance of the bearing surface. The force of friction is different for different lubricants. The coefficient of friction. It is defined as the ratio of the limiting friction to the normal reaction between the two bodies. Limiting friction is specified as F and normal reaction or suffix N. It is generally denoted by mu, mathematical coefficient of friction. Limiting angle of friction, weight of the body W, applied horizontal force P, and a reaction between the body A and the plane, limit angle of friction. The reaction R must therefore be equal and opposite to the resultant of the W and P and will be inclined at an angle phi to the normal reaction or suffix N. This angle phi is known as limiting angle of friction. It may be defined as the angle which the resultant reaction makes with the normal reaction or suffix N. So tan phi is equal to F by Rn is equal to mu into Rn by Rn, that's equal to mu.